Okay, this is week 7, and I'm going to be shifting to this text for the next week or two. So if you want to, you might have to purchase this book if you want to look at it. And I'll be looking at chapter 4 in the book. It's called Controlling the Flow, and the first half of chapter 4 in this book is about using if-then statements. And so we actually already covered that, fortunately. So we'll continue now with the second topic in controlling the flow, which is about using loops. Now I'll just tell you, since this book might mention this sometime in our discussion of loops, because they covered this topic here when they were talking about if-then statements, and that's called a nested if statement. And all that means is that you have an if statement here, if and end if, but inside there you have another if statement, and you're allowed to do that. And you might come across times when you want to do that, and it's okay. You just you should make sure that you have an if and an end if for this one, and then an if and an end if here. So I'm not really going to spend too much time on that, but you should just be aware that it's okay to do that, and that it is called a nested if statement. And you can have more than one nested statement. In other words, you could have something inside this one. You have another if-then statement inside this if-then statement. Okay, so you could have more than one nest. And they also say something here that we've seen already, and that is you can have a one-line if-then statement, and then you don't need the and if. So if it's all in one line, you can just do it like this, and notice they only have an if and then then. Okay, they don't have an and if. In fact, they even have an else here, and still they don't have an and if. Okay, so for a one-line if-then statement, you don't need an and if, but otherwise you do, because otherwise it won't know where to stop. So you have to tell it where to stop. And a little bit more here about how this text, what some of the things that are in this text. They are using a function here called CType, and it means convert a type to something else. So if you look at this variable, you can see that it's declared as an integer. And here it is. Here's this variable. But they're putting in this text value dot text, so that's not an integer. That's text. So to be careful, we want to convert text to an integer, and that's what this CType will do. It will take what you have in here and convert it to what you have here. So it's going to convert it to an integer, and so therefore it's okay to assign it to this variable. So that's CType. And just as a quick review of and or, here we have an if-then statement. So it says if this variable is 2 and this variable is 3. So when is this true, that both of the that this expression is true? This conditional expression is true. When is it true? Well, it means that this variable has to be 2 and this variable has to be 3. So it will be true, and then it will say, hello, both of the conditions have been satisfied. So that's when this message will be shown, is if both of these are true. However, if we had or there, then when would this be true? If either one of these would, so if int x was equal to 2 and this one was equal to 5, this statement would still be true. Okay, and it would say, hello, one of the conditions has been satisfied. Okay, that's a little review of and or. And let's read this. He gives us a little warning here about doing string comparisons. So we're doing a string comparison. We have a variable, and we're asking, is it equal to that? This is not an assignment. This is it equal to? So he defines this variable as a string first at the beginning, and then he assigns this variable to Winston is assigned to this variable, and then he says, is this equal to that? And the answer is no, because we say that here, this word, case sensitive. So Visual Basic is case sensitive, means that, notice that this has small letters in it, and these are all capitals. So Visual Basic won't say they're the same. So we call that being case sensitive. So it won't, we won't see this message box, in other words. Now here he gives us a way to get around that, and let's see how he does it. So first we have the same thing, string name as string. Here we assign it something from a text box, and then we say this, we do this statement. Okay, and here so we want to string compare. String.compare is a function, and the first we put one of the things we're comparing with the other thing that we're comparing. Okay, and but we put this as true, and true means check to see whether they're the same regardless of whether they're capitals or not. So that's what true will do. False would say no, that capitals matter, and so they wouldn't be true in this case. But in this case, we have it as true. That will mean that whether it's capital or not, it doesn't matter, so it's not going to be case sensitive. Now it's a little bit strange that when it's true, when it works, it equals 0. We're testing whether it equals 0. It's 0 means basically how many differences are there. So if it's equal to 0, it means there's no differences between this and this when we don't care about case sensitivity, when it's not going to be case sensitive. So there's no differences. That's how to think about this 0. Now we're not going to talk about this, but he gives you a way to do something similar when you're using the select case structure. So I'm not going to go through that, but if you wanted to read it, you could. Okay, so today we're going to start with loops. We're going to talk about loops. And loops are a very important part of programming. Loops allow you to do basically a repeated task many times. And that's one of the powers of using a computer or using a program. For example, he says, you might need to create a telephone bill for all your customers. So you have this program that creates a telephone bill, and you want to loop it to get it to repeat over and over and over again for each of your customers. Okay, so you could have 25 million customers, and you could just run this loop, and it would generate a telephone bill for each of those 25 million customers. So loops can be very useful, very powerful. So we're going to study the for next loop. That's the first kind of loop that we're going to study. Now, you know that it's a good idea to do a search for something on the internet. You might search for this. You might get something like this. There's two entries here I see from Microsoft Development Network, MSDN. Here's something for VBScript. Now it's going to be fine to read this, but VBScript is not the same as Visual Basic. It's a little bit different. Here's something from Wikipedia. So it talks about a for loop, but that's not strictly for Visual Basic. Basically every language will do the same thing, but might have a slightly different way of indicating that that it's doing that. So you have to be careful to get the right syntax. But anyway, there's in fact, you can see that all these languages do this. And here's a video. It's not my video, but so here's a Visual Basic tutorial for next loop. So you might want to take a look at this as well. Okay, so let's try to build his program. So he wants you to create a new, so I want you to do this. Create a new Windows form application, call it loops, add a list box and a button control to the form. Change the name property of the list box data to list data, so he's using modified Hungarian notation, and its integral height property to false. I think that will allow you to make the size of the box as you like. And change the name property of the button to button for next loop. So that's the name property, btn, for next loop, and set its text property to for next loop, so it'll look like this. You'll be adding more buttons later, so make this button a little wider as shown in figure 4.7. Okay, double click the button to create its click event handler and add the following bolded code. So let's take a look. So basically what he wants you to build is something like this, and then when you click on this, a loop runs, something gets repeated over and over again, and what's going to happen is it's going to add repeated elements into this box, but the elements are not going to be exactly the same, but a loop will accomplish it like that. Okay, and if I click it again, you can't really see it, but it just clears what was there and then does it again. So how do we accomplish this? Using a loop. So I want you to do this. Type this in. Okay, and you'll get some complaint here because it doesn't know what this is, because this is a procedure. It's we say we're calling a procedure. We're getting a procedure to run here, but the procedure hasn't been defined yet, so it won't like that at first. But you're going to define this procedure and then use it inside the button call, inside the button click procedure. So after you have typed this, then you're going to type this. So this is the loop that we want to discuss, but first type it, and then after you type this, then you're going to create a second sub, and that will be here. I'll show you where. So first you're going to type this plus the comments, which I didn't really write here, and then outside of the button sub, you're going to write another sub down here, and it's going to look like this. So here, type this, and then type this, and then then try and run it and make sure that it's working, and then let's talk about how it works. So you can pause this as you type it and check it. Okay, now I'll assume that you're back, and let's think about how this worked. Now the first thing that we had in there was here. We called this sub-procedure called clear the list. Remember, this is all taking place inside our button click. So we're calling a function which hasn't actually been defined yet by us, but we do define it below, and so we can call it here. So we call that function, and all that does, what does that do? Let's read it. All it does is it takes our list box and clears all the items. So items are an object which has this method associated with it. So you can use this method when you have items from a list data. So this function is already written for us. We didn't have to write that, but we're putting this statement inside our sub, which we've called ClearList. Now, since there's only one line of code, it's a little bit not necessary to write a separate sub for it. But if there were, say, 5 lines of code that we had in here, then it might be worthwhile to create this new method which we could call, which would run those 5 lines of code, so we wouldn't have to retype those 5 lines of code every time. All we'd have to do is write this, and that would be like typing the 5 lines of code. That's the point of creating a function. Okay, so anyway, what were we doing? First thing we did was we declared an integer, a variable as an integer. And now we call this function, which we just saw what it was. It just clears the items. So it's going to clear any items that are in the box currently. And now we get to the loop. So let's look at it. It says for, and this is the variable that we just created up above. This is this variable. So it's an integer. So it says for, this variable goes from 1 to 5. So we're going to what's going to happen in this for loop is that the first time through the loop, we say it goes through a loop, goes through loops. The first time through the loop, this int count, this variable, is going to be equal to 1. So let's think what happens. So what happens is this. We go, what does this say? We're referring now to our list box. We have items there. We're going to add something. So what is it going to add? It's going to add I'm item. Notice there's a little space here which makes it easier to read. I'm item, and then the ampersand, and then so we're concatenating with this. Okay, so what is this? This is taking our integer, and we're allowed to do this. We're allowed to convert it to a string. So it's a 1, and it's still going to be a 1, but it's going to be a 1 as a string, not as a number when we do this. Okay, we're converting it to a string. And then we're concatenating that with this string. Remember, concatenations operator, the concatenation operator, puts together strings. So this is a string, and this last one is certainly a string. And this one is a string because we took it, actually it was an integer, but we converted it to a string. This is one way to convert it to a string. So we did that. Okay? Okay. So now remember, this is all the first loop. So we're doing all this, but this int count is 1, and then it gets converted to 1, but as text. So what it's going to say is, I'm item 1 in the list. Okay? Now that's finished. This is the end of the for loop, we say. So what happens is, we go to the next value for int count. So int count starts at 1, and it goes up to 5, and it goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Currently, it's just 1. Now we go up here, and we say it gets incremented by 1 up to 2. So it started at 1, so it got incremented by 1 up to 2. So now it's 2, and then we run the same code that's inside here as we did before. So what are we going to do? We're going to add something new. I'm item, and now it's going to be 2 in the list. So we're adding a new item to the list, and it's going to say I'm item 2 in the list. And then that's finished. We get down to here, and the next line of code is next, so that means we're finished that round of the loop. So then we go back up to the top, but int count now gets incremented by 1 more. Now it was 2, so it gets incremented to 3. And then we do it again. What's going to happen now? We're going to add a new item to the list box, and it's going to say I'm item, and now this is going to be 3 to the list. So it's going to say I'm item 3 in the list. And so it will keep going until it gets up to 5. It'll do it for 5. You can see that it's written for 5. And then it stops. And then we go outside the next loop. So we go to the next line. In this case, the next line is just AND. So we're finished. Okay? Okay, so that's an example of a loop. Okay, I'll stop and start a new video.